Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now, let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Zara sat by the window of her father's mansion, no longer seeing the world outside, but rather the endless storm within her soul. The silence around her was as suffocating as the lies she had been forced to live in. Her father's empire, Bryan's pretentious apologies, the loneliness of her lavish prison, all of it felt like thorns wrapped around her throat. Emeka's face haunted her dreams. His voice, once full of fire and hope, now echoed like a ghost through the empty chambers of her heart. She had no solid proof of his innocence yet, but she had one weapon, her belief in him. With trembling hands and red eyes, she signed the documents her discreet lawyer had prepared. The petition for a case review against Emeka's conviction was filed. She didn't know what outcome awaited her, victory or more pain, but she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Filing that petition was the first ripple in a storm Zara could no longer contain. Her father had warned her multiple times to let the past die, but Zara had already buried too much. Her voice, her love, her truth. Now, as the days passed and word of the case spread through whispers in legal corridors, the weight of her decision intensified. Suddenly, friends stopped calling. Her phone rang only with threats or silence. Bryan's allies in the media tried to spin false stories, painting her as emotionally unstable and obsessed with a man who had wronged her. Even in the court of public opinion, Emeka was still a prisoner, and so was she. But Zara refused to back down. She met with her lawyer in secret, prepared statements, gathered what little evidence she could, and prepared to face whatever shadow was about to fall over her life. The scars of silence were far worse than any consequence she could face now. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the sudden backlash from her own inner circle. Bryan visited the house again, pretending to be concerned, playing the role of a caring fiancé. "You're ruining everything we've built, Zara," he said, smiling with that deceptive calm he always wore. "Emeka's gone. This obsession will destroy you." But Zara stared back at him with eyes that no longer begged, no longer hoped. "He is not gone. You are just afraid of the truth," she said. "And this time I will not stop until it destroys you first." Bryan's smile cracked for a second before he recovered, brushing a hand through his hair and walking out. Zara watched him go, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a strange flicker inside her. Not hope, not relief, but fire. Something had shifted. She had picked a fight with the kind of people who crush spirits for fun. But this time, Zara Okafor was not folding. Inside the thick, humid walls of a wary correctional facility, the world moved like treacle. Time slowed. Air was stale. Emeka sat quietly on the iron bunk of his cell, staring at the windowless wall, his mind lost somewhere between rage and ruin. The days had become a blur. Pain was a constant companion. Yet his mind never wandered far from two things, his mother's voice and Zara's smile. Then, one afternoon, the guards called him out without warning. He thought maybe his lawyer had come, maybe news of freedom, or even a message from Zara. But when he stepped into the visitation area and saw Bryan sitting smugly on the other side of the glass, his chest went still. There was no guard between them, just a wide table, and thick silence that cracked like thunder when Bryan finally spoke. Bryan didn't waste time. "You know, I almost had it all. Zara, her father's empire, everything." He leaned forward, hands clasped like a preacher at a pulpit. "But then you came with your hammer and mud and ruined it." Emeka's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Bryan chuckled and continued, "You think you're a hero? You're a fool. I bribed the judges, the guards, hell, even the press. You're here because I wanted you here. And if you ever try to come back into Zara's life, I'll do worse. Remember your mother? Next time, she won't survive the accident." Emeka's hands balled into fists under the table, trembling with fury, but he still didn't speak. Bryan smirked. "Smart man. Keep quiet. Because the moment you try anything, your pain will multiply." He stood, tapped twice on the table like a judge closing court, and walked out. When the guards led Emeka back to his cell, something inside him had changed. He had learned how to endure pain. He had learned how to survive betrayal. But what Bryan had just done, threatening the only two people Emeka had ever loved, unlocked something deeper than anger. It was resolve. Emeka sat back on the bunk, breathing slowly, eyes closed. He didn't need to scream or shout. He just needed time. Time to get out. Time to plan. Time to bring Bryan down not with fists, but with fire. Fire born not from hatred, but from truth. For now he would wait. But when that prison door opened, he wouldn't walk out a broken man. He would walk out as a force Bryan never imagined he had created. Zara stormed into her father's private study like a whirlwind, her hands trembling, her voice already raw from the arguments she'd had with Bryan earlier. Chief Okafor was seated with a tumbler of whiskey, his eyes fixed on a newspaper that now served as nothing but a distraction from the guilt he tried to bury. She stood before him, tears threatening to spill, but fury burning stronger. "You're too quiet, Dad," she snapped. "Too damn quiet to be innocent. What are you hiding?" He looked up, startled by her voice, but said nothing. "Emeka's mother is in a coma because of what your silence helped fuel. His life is shattered. And you? You sit here drinking." Her words hit like bullets. He tried to speak, but she didn't let him. "Do you want to bury me next? Is that what it will take for you to care?" The room was tense. Chief Okafor rose, placing the tumbler down slowly, but Zara stepped back, lifting something from her purse, a bottle of pills. "If I'm wrong, then stop me. But if you stay silent, I'll take these, right here, right now, and let the world know who killed me." Her voice cracked. "Because I'm tired of watching everyone I love suffer, while you stand behind your curtains pretending to be noble." That was when Chief Okafor moved. Not with anger, but panic. He rushed to her, slapped the pills from her hand, and pulled her into his arms. "Zara, stop," he yelled, his voice shaking for the first time. "I swear on your mother's life, I have no hand in what happened to that boy or his mother. But I will help. I will find out the truth." For the first time in years, his voice broke. Zara sobbed in his arms, not from pain, but from the brief relief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this anymore. Chief Okafor held her tighter, his mind already racing. He had allowed too many things to slide under the guise of control. But now, this wasn't about politics or reputation. It was about justice. It was about a girl who used to smile at the stars, and a boy who shaped fire into art. "I will use every connection I have," he whispered. "We'll find the truth together." Zara nodded weakly, holding him as though it was the first time she had ever known he could still feel. Somewhere in the storm of her heart, a spark was lit. If her father, the man who once told her love was weakness, was now willing to fight beside her, then maybe, just maybe, justice had a chance. Chief Okafor had always prided himself on control of his empire, his daughter's future, and every decision that affected the family name. But after Zara's breakdown, something broke inside him. The words she screamed, about pain, about love, about Emeka's mother lying half dead in a hospital, echoed louder than the speeches of any boardroom. Sitting alone in his private study, surrounded by dusty files and glowing monitors, he decided to do what he hadn't done in years: seek the truth without agenda. He called in favors, summoned retired judges, and even paid a discreet visit to the Ministry of Justice under the cover of night. When the sealed files of Emeka's trial were finally dropped in front of him, his hands trembled. What he found inside wasn't just troubling, it was an abomination. The testimonies were fake, signed by witnesses who didn't exist or had been silenced. The paperwork from the initial arrest was altered. The judge assigned had been transferred days before the ruling, yet the sentencing document bore his signature. It was all a masterclass in corruption, tied together by untraceable bribes, closed-door whispers, and forged identities. And buried in a letter dated weeks ago was something that chilled Chief Okafor to his bones: a denial from Emeka to plead guilty, overwritten by another signature and stamped with the judge's approval. His vision blurred, not from old age, but shame. He remembered Bryan once mentioning something about handling things like a man. It now clicked. This was the work of a man who feared losing power more than losing his soul. He sat back in his chair, removed his glasses, and covered his face with his hands. The iron-willed tycoon, feared across boardrooms, felt small. How could he, with all his power and surveillance, not have seen the hell Bryan orchestrated? How had he let his daughter love a man and suffer for it under his own roof? For the first time in years, Chief Okafor wept, not for his business empire, but for the truth he had helped suppress with silence. The next morning, without fanfare or guards, he visited the hospital where Emeka's mother lay. He stood at the door of her room for a long while, unable to enter, simply whispering, "I'm sorry." He walked out with a renewed sense of purpose, not just to support Zara, but to undo what Bryan had destroyed. The courtroom was quiet that morning. No media, no family, just a few legal aides and dusty wooden benches. The process had been expedited under Chief Okafor's influence, but that didn't ease the weight of the moment. When Emeka stepped out from the holding cell into the corridor, he didn't react. No joy, no anger, just a numb silence that made the guards nervous. His body had changed, thinner but more muscular, with new scars tracing his forearms. His eyes, however, remained untouched, deep pools of smoldering quiet. A man who had learned to survive pain by burying hope. The judge read the order of release, signed with immediate effect. But even as the chains were unlocked from his wrists, Emeka didn't move. It wasn't freedom he had waited for, it was truth, and that had not yet been delivered. Zara stood outside the courthouse, eyes scanning every passing face. When she finally saw him emerge, flanked by two lawyers, she ran toward him, but stopped halfway. Emeka paused, eyes meeting hers. The connection was instant, but his expression didn't change. No smile, no relief, just deep, aching exhaustion. Zara wanted to run into his arms, to cry and tell him how hard she fought, but something in his stillness held her back. She lowered her head. "I waited for you," she whispered. Emeka looked away, then stepped past her toward the waiting car. "Where's my mother?" he asked one of the aides coldly. The pain behind that question split Zara in two. The reunion she dreamed of didn't come. What met her instead was a ghost, one forged in chains. Back at the hospital, Emeka stood at the foot of his mother's bed. Machines beeped softly. Tubes ran from her frail arms. Her face, once filled with laughter and scolding wisdom, was now pale and motionless. He didn't cry. He didn't speak for the first minute. Then he pulled out the only possession he had left, Zara's bracelet, which he had hidden through years of prison checks. Placing it gently on his mother's hand, he whispered, "I'm back, Mama, and I swear they will pay." Zara, who had followed him quietly into the room, stayed near the door, uncertain whether she was welcomed. Emeka didn't turn, but he said clearly, "Don't come close until I know you didn't help them." The words hit harder than any prison gate. Zara stepped back. She now knew the battle was no longer to free him. It was to reclaim him from what pain had made him. The blacksmith they once knew was gone. In his place stood a man reborn in rage. Emeka spent his days by his mother's side, and nights retracing every step that led to his downfall. He no longer flinched at pain. He embraced it. Every scar on his body became fuel. His silence became his strategy. The guards who once beat him now feared his gaze. Even in release, Emeka carried the weight of iron chains in his soul. He studied documents Zara gave him, legal briefs, security footage, handwritten letters. Every new piece of evidence made him clench his fists. Bryan. That name rang like a war drum in his head. Bryan had destroyed not just his life, but his mother's health, Zara's peace, and the dreams he forged in fire. One evening, he visited the hospital alone. His mother's fingers twitched, but she remained unconscious. Emeka sat beside her, holding her hand. "They think they've won," he whispered. "They think love is weak." He kissed her forehead gently. "You told me once to be strong, to forgive, but not when the enemy comes for the innocent. I will forgive when justice is served." He reached into his coat and brought out a rusted hammer, once from his old forge. "I will remake what they broke, Mama. I promise you that." Outside the hospital window, the city buzzed with noise and movement, but inside Emeka's heart, there was only fire. Quiet, controlled, dangerous. Meanwhile, Zara moved between guilt and strength. She could feel Emeka pulling away, but she refused to give up. She began coordinating with her father, now her unlikely ally, to trace Bryan's activities. Together, they tracked shell companies, fake accounts, even blackmail networks. Bryan was planning something desperate. And Emeka knew he wouldn't wait. He was no longer just a man searching for truth. He was a fire waiting to consume the liar who stole everything. And this time, he wouldn't be alone. The sterile hospital hallway felt colder than prison walls as Emeka stood at the doorway of his mother's room. Machines beeped rhythmically, but nothing felt alive inside her. Her face was pale, lips dry, and eyes sealed in a painful slumber. For a moment, Emeka froze. He'd carried the weight of betrayal, imprisonment, and silence, but this was heavier. He walked in, slowly, each step a throb in his chest. Sitting beside her, he took her fragile hand into his hardened palms now scarred from chains, burns, and blood. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Mama, it's me, your son. I'm back, but they tried to erase me." The room didn't answer, but his soul did. Anger curled around his heart like molten iron waiting to be forged. Emeka's pain didn't dull with time. It sharpened like a blade. As he looked at his mother, his memories rolled back to her laughter, the way she hummed while preparing ogbono soup, her little sayings that made hardship feel bearable. Now, silence replaced all of that, and in that silence, a storm brewed. He didn't want justice from a courtroom anymore. He wanted retribution from the soul. The image of Bryan laughing in the prison hallway haunted him, and the thought that someone had dared to harm the woman who had given up everything to raise him, just to keep him away from Zara, awakened a version of himself he didn't recognize. This wasn't the soft-spoken blacksmith anymore. This was someone forged from betrayal, locked in darkness, and reborn through fire. Before leaving the room, Emeka bent down, pressing his lips gently on his mother's forehead. "They will answer, Mama," he whispered, eyes glowing with unshed tears and fury. "Every one of them. For every bruise, every lie, every second I was locked up, and for what they did to you." As he stepped out, Zara stood at a distance, clutching the doorframe, her face streaked with tears. She didn't speak, but Emeka did. "I'm not the same, Zara. I can't pretend nothing happened. I love you, but I have to finish this war." And with that, he walked past her, not to escape her, but to confront the world that tore them apart. The meeting between Chief Okafor and Emeka was one born from pain, not tradition. The chief, usually seated with pride and poise, stood nervously in the garden outside the hospital where Emeka had agreed to meet him. When Emeka finally appeared, dressed plainly but radiating silent authority, the chief looked at him with the eyes of a man seeing fire in human form. "You've changed," he said, almost in a whisper. Emeka nodded, his gaze calm but unreadable. "Chains do that to a man," he replied. There was a pause, heavy and strained. Then the chief motioned for them to sit on the stone bench beneath a mango tree. For the first time, father and Flame sat face to face, not to argue, but to understand. "I was wrong," Chief Okafor admitted, breaking the silence. "Not just about you, but about everything. I let wealth and legacy blind me." Emeka looked at him, no anger, just truth in his voice. "You didn't just ruin me. You almost destroyed your daughter. Do you know what she became while I was gone? A shell in her own palace." The chief dropped his eyes, breathing heavily. "I see it now. I see how much she loves you. And I see how much you love her, because if you didn't, you would have disappeared by now." Emeka nodded slowly. "I stayed because of her, and because I want you to see what you nearly destroyed." There was a long silence before the chief whispered, "What do you need from me?" And Emeka's response was firm, "Stay out of my way, or stand with me. Nothing in between." As the sun began to set, Chief Okafor placed a hand on Emeka's shoulder, the first gesture of acceptance. "If I'm to bless any man for my daughter, let it be the one who fought not with gold, but with scars," he said. It was the closest he would ever come to saying, "I'm proud of you," and it was enough. As they stood, a quiet understanding passed between them. One man forged in fire, the other finally stepping into its warmth. The war wasn't over. Bryan still roamed free. But for once, Emeka didn't feel alone in the battlefield. Bryan paced in his penthouse like a caged vulture. His empire was crumbling. Chief Okafor had begun investigating the prison files. Zara was slipping further out of his control, and Emeka, the one he thought buried behind bars, had returned. Rage clawed at his throat. He'd worked too hard to secure the future. Zara's inheritance, her father's trust, the public image of a perfect son-in-law. Now all of it dangled by a thread. In a desperate final act, Bryan planned to kidnap Zara and flee the country. He forged documents, bribed a private pilot, and contacted corrupt police officers to distract anyone who might trace them. This wasn't just about love anymore. It was war. He sent Zara a message through her assistant, begging for one last meeting. Just to talk, the message read. Somewhere quiet. Hesitant but determined to hear the truth for herself, Zara agreed, but not without precaution. Unknown to Bryan, Emeka had already intercepted his movements. Through one of the corrupt officers, who'd had a change of heart, Emeka learned about the location and time. It was a secluded beachside house, once owned by Bryan's cousin, now abandoned. Emeka arrived first, hiding among the shadows, fists clenched, heart pounding. He wasn't sure what would happen, but he was ready to die if it meant protecting Zara. As Bryan led Zara into the house under the guise of reconciliation, his tone changed. He began shouting, accusing her of ruining his life for a blacksmith. When she tried to run, he grabbed her roughly. "You think your blacksmith will save you now? You think you can walk away from me?" he hissed. But before she could scream again, the door burst open. Emeka stormed in like a flame reborn. The two men clashed in a brutal, raw fight. Bryan punched, kicked, scratched, but Emeka fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. Finally, with blood dripping from his lip and fire in his eyes, Emeka pinned Bryan down just as police sirens echoed in the distance. Zara collapsed into Emeka's arms, sobbing, "I knew you'd come." And for the first time since prison, Emeka smiled, not in peace, but in victory. The night air was thick with tension. Zara, lured by Bryan to an isolated warehouse under the guise of reconciliation, found herself trapped in a nightmare. Her phone had been taken, the building surrounded by Bryan's thugs, and his eyes burned with the desperation of a man losing control. He ranted about power, inheritance, and betrayal, pacing like a wild animal while Zara stood firm, her silence louder than any scream. Just as Bryan lunged to grab her, a sharp bang echoed in the distance. The police had arrived. Behind them, emerging from the shadows like a blade drawn from fire, was Emeka. Emeka's presence ignited chaos. He tackled Bryan without hesitation, their bodies crashing against dusty crates and shattered glass. Every punch Emeka threw carried the weight of his mother's pain, his unjust years behind bars, and Zara's stolen tears. Bryan, though stronger, was no match for Emeka's fury born of suffering. The fight was brutal and raw, but Emeka's resolve never wavered. When the officers finally pulled them apart, Bryan was bloodied and trembling. Emeka stood over him, chest heaving, eyes red. "You tried to bury me alive," he growled. "But fire refines. And now, you'll burn in the same cage you built for me." Zara collapsed into Emeka's arms, sobbing. "I knew you'd come," she whispered through trembling lips. Their embrace was the kind that silenced chaos, the kind that reminded the world that no matter how deep betrayal runs, love can claw its way back from hell. As Bryan was dragged away screaming, the officers saluted Emeka, recognizing him not just as a victim, but as a man who fought through steel and storm. For the first time in years, Zara smiled. It wasn't wide, but it was real, and it was the beginning of a new dawn. Chief Okafor stood before the hospital bed like a man confronting a ghost. Emeka's mother lay unconscious, her pale face bruised but breathing. The sterile air of the room smelled of antiseptic and regret. In his tailored suit and polished shoes, the chief seemed out of place, stripped of his pride, holding a bouquet of white flowers, the same kind Emeka had once gifted Zara when he was still just a blacksmith in dusty clothes. The chief slowly knelt beside the bed, lowered his head, and whispered, I am sorry. For the silence. For the blindness. For everything I did and everything I didn't. Zara stood at the door, watching in stunned silence. She had never seen her father like this. The same man who once barked orders and manipulated her life now looked like a child seeking forgiveness. Emeka entered moments later, pausing at the sight. There was no anger in his eyes, only grief. He stepped forward, touched his mother's hand gently, and then looked down at Chief Okafor. She never deserved any of this, he said, voice trembling. But if your apology is real, let it show in what you do next, not just in words. The chief nodded, rising to his feet. You have my word, Emeka, he said. Whatever wealth, power, or pride I held, it means nothing now. If your mother wakes up, I will spend the rest of my life making it right. He turned to Zara, tears in his eyes. You loved right, and I failed to see it. Forgive me, my daughter. Zara hugged him, overwhelmed, finally feeling the father she had longed for. For that moment, titles, money, and pain disappeared. They stood not as enemies divided by class, but as broken people choosing to heal together. The room was quiet except for the soft beep of machines and the rhythmic drip of 4 fluids. Emeka sat beside his mother, head bowed, fingers tightly wrapped around hers. His heart ached with memories, the sound of her laugh, the smell of her cooking, the strength in her voice when everyone else gave up on him. Zara sat quietly on the other side of the bed, tears tracing down her cheeks. They had lit candles, played her favorite hymns, and even brought her old scarf from home. But for days she hadn't moved. Until now. It was faint at first, a slight twitch in her fingers. Emeka stiffened, not daring to hope. Then her lips parted slightly, dry and cracked. Her eyes fluttered open like delicate wings breaking from darkness. Emeka, she whispered, barely audible. Emeka let out a choked sob, his forehead pressing to her hand. Mama, I'm here. I'm here. Zara cried openly now, grabbing her other hand. The doctors rushed in, amazed by her sudden responsiveness. But Emeka didn't care what miracle they called it. To him, it was simply love refusing to let go. Through her tears, Emeka's mother smiled faintly, her gaze shifting between her son and Zara. I told you, she murmured. Love forged in pain will always burn the brightest. The line silenced them all. In that fragile moment, the weight of every wound, every betrayal, and every battle melted. Zara leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Emeka didn't speak again. He couldn't. But his heart whispered 1,000 things: gratitude, apology, promise. That night, as the city buzzed outside, a mother came back to life, not for herself, but for the 2 souls who never stopped believing. The next morning, Emeka returned to the place where it had all begun, his dusty, abandoned workshop tucked at the edge of the slums. The walls were cracked, soot still lingered from long-forgotten fires, and broken metal tools lay scattered like the memories of a man who once had dreams. It was painful to be back, but necessary. He needed to find what prison tried to strip from him: his identity. He took a deep breath, exhaled the dust of suffering, and approached the anvil where he'd once crafted art from iron. In his pocket was the broken bracelet Zara gave him, recovered from police evidence, and returned by her father. It was rusted now, but its meaning remained intact. He ran his fingers over its shape like it was the spine of a story unfinished. He lit the forge, hands trembling, sweat dripping, not from heat, but from the emotional weight of memory. With every swing of the hammer, Emeka could feel the ghosts of betrayal, the echoes of Bryan's laughter, the screams from prison walls, and his mother's weeping. But with every strike, he also remembered Zara's voice, her tears, her courage, and her refusal to let the world swallow them. The bracelet began to reshape. It didn't become a new bracelet. This time, it became a ring, a symbol of rebirth, endurance, and eternal love. He engraved a single word inside the band: freedom. As the metal cooled, he stared at it with reverence. It wasn't just jewelry. It was an oath. He would wear this not only as her husband, but as a man who swore to protect everything they had rebuilt. Zara arrived just as the final hammer fell. She didn't interrupt, just watched, tears in her eyes, pride in her heart. Emeka turned, his face smudged with ash, and extended the ring. "This isn't from a store," he said quietly. "It's made from our pain and our love." Zara accepted it, her hands trembling, and kissed his soot-stained cheek. They stood in that workshop, surrounded by remnants of a life torn apart, and knew they were ready. The past no longer had power here. It was behind them, scorched and forged into something stronger. Their wedding wasn't going to be about flowers or champagne. It would be about survival, scars, and two hearts that refused to die. As they walked out of the workshop, hand in hand, the fire behind them dimmed, its purpose fulfilled. They were ready to vow their lives in truth, no longer caged by fear. The wedding was unlike any Chief Okafor had ever attended. There were no gold-plated invitations, no government dignitaries, and no television cameras. It was held in a modest garden, surrounded by trees and silence. The only sound was the wind and the hushed sniffles of those in attendance. Zara wore a simple white gown, her hair curled down her shoulders like waves of peace. Emeka wore a clean, traditional outfit, ironed and pure, his hands still scarred, but strong. Chief Okafor stood near the altar, watching them both with a proud but remorseful gaze. In his silence, he admitted to himself that this was love, the kind forged from ruin, not riches. When the priest asked for vows, Emeka took Zara's hand, looking deep into her eyes, and said, "I loved you even when you didn't know. I waited even when I was chained. And today, I vow to never leave, not even if the world ends." Zara, barely able to speak through tears, responded, "They tried to break us. They lied, tore us apart, and caged you for crimes you never committed. But you never stopped loving, and I will never stop choosing you." The guests wept openly, even the chief wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. When the couple kissed, it was not just a symbol of union, it was victory. The crowd erupted in claps, not cheers, because this moment demanded reverence, not celebration. As they walked down the aisle, petals falling from hands that once held pain, Zara whispered, "This is our beginning." Emeka nodded, "And no one will ever write our ending again." That night, under the stars, they didn't throw a party. Instead, they sat by the old anvil, hands joined, reflecting on the fire they had passed through. There were no more chains, only rings. No more lies, only truth. Emeka's mother, still recovering, sent a handwritten letter that simply said, "You are my miracle." Chief Okafor approached them before midnight and gave Emeka a small, locked box. Inside, he said, is a deed to a new blacksmith facility. Your name is on it. Build your life now. Emeka looked up in shock, but the chief only said, "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but it means you're free to live." And so they did. The days following the wedding were supposed to be a honeymoon of healing, but instead, they were marred by attacks from the media and whispers in elite circles. Headlines mocked Zara, billionaire's daughter marries ex-convict, and Okafor empire now in hands of a blacksmith. Pundits dissected every detail of their union, framing it as a rebellion instead of a love story. Reporters camped at their gate, trying to get a glimpse of Emeka, the man they once called nobody. Zara refused to respond publicly, but the weight of their ridicule pressed on her heart. She knew how these stories could destroy reputations and careers, but this time, she wasn't going to let them destroy her love. She urged Emeka to ignore them, but she knew deep down he was hurting too, not because of the headlines, but because of how easily people judged what they didn't understand. Chief Okafor, watching from a distance, realized his silence was no longer protection. It had become consent. So, in a rare public appearance, he organized a press conference. As the cameras rolled, he walked out with Emeka and Zara, surprising everyone. Dressed in traditional regalia, with eyes that had seen war and politics, the chief raised Emeka's hand and declared, "This is not just my son-in-law. This is the man I trust with my legacy." The silence was palpable. "If you think his past disqualifies him, then you don't know the value of redemption," he continued. "I once built this empire with grit and steel. And Emeka, he is forged from the same fire." The crowd was stunned. It wasn't just a speech, It was a declaration that changed the public narrative overnight. For the first time, people began to see the man, not just the headlines. Emeka stood beside the chief, stunned but proud. For years, he had been told he wasn't enough. Not educated enough, not rich enough, not good enough. Now, the man who once opposed him was defending his honor in front of the entire country. Zara looked at her father with quiet tears in her eyes, realizing that while he had failed them before, this was a moment of redemption. That night, social media shifted. Comments that once mocked began to praise. Support flooded in from strangers who saw the power of forgiveness and the beauty of a love story that refused to die. Emeka, once caged, now walked in light, not just for himself, but for every soul who ever believed that pain could be the beginning of purpose. The trial of Bryan began in a packed courtroom that pulsed with tension. The case had caught public interest for weeks now, not just because of Bryan's elite status, but because of the depth of his crimes. He stood accused of falsifying documents, bribing judicial officials, intimidating witnesses, orchestrating attempted murder, and abuse of power. With slick back hair and an arrogant smirk, Bryan walked into the courtroom flanked by expensive lawyers. But his usual swagger had a tremble to it. For the first time, he wasn't in control. His attempts to delay proceedings had failed. The evidence against him, once hidden, had emerged like a river breaking through a dam. One by one, testimonies from guards, lawyers, even some bribed accomplices, came forward under immunity agreements. The room buzzed with horror as each layer of corruption was peeled back. Then came the most unexpected moment. The door opened, and Emeka walked in. Dressed in a clean, simple outfit with a visible scar on his arm, he stepped up to the witness stand. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Bryan's smirk faded completely. Emeka began to speak, not in anger, not in bitterness, but with the weight of a man who had been through hell and still chose dignity. He spoke of the night of his arrest, the false charges, the years in prison, and the torment of being separated from his sick mother. Every word struck like a hammer on an anvil. When he finished, the judge removed her glasses and paused before continuing. She looked at Bryan and said, "You didn't just try to ruin a man's life. You tried to erase it." The gavel struck. Bryan was no longer the predator. He was the prey. The court sentenced Bryan to 25 years without parole. No one applauded. There was no celebration. Only a collective exhale of justice finally done. Outside the courtroom, Zara met Emeka's eyes with a quiet smile. They didn't need to say anything. The nightmare was over, at least this part of it. For Bryan, prison would be a new world, one where money couldn't bend rules and fear couldn't buy silence. For Emeka, it wasn't revenge that satisfied him, it was truth. The man who tried to break him now bore the weight of his own lies. As they left the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Emeka gave only one sentence: "Let this remind the world that the poor are not powerless. We're just silent until we rise." A week after Bryan's sentencing, Zara stood outside the iron bars of a gray, emotionless prison visiting room. She had asked for one final visit, not out of pity, but for closure. Bryan was let in, wearing a wrinkled orange jumpsuit, eyes sunken, ego bruised. He looked at her, searching for the version of Zara he once controlled, the one he manipulated, gaslit, and dangled promises before. But this woman? She was fire. She was forged. He sat across from her, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, with a forced smile, he asked, "Did you ever love me, Zara?" His voice cracked slightly. It wasn't the question she expected, but her answer had lived in her heart for years. "No," she replied softly. "I pitied you. I thought you were broken like me. But you were just selfish. And that's worse." Her words hung in the air, heavier than steel. Bryan's facade collapsed in a mixture of shame and rage. He reached forward, but the guard warned him back. Zara stood up slowly, her voice steady. "You caged Emeka because you were scared he'd be the man you could never be. You were right." She turned and walked away without looking back. Bryan slammed his fist against the table and screamed her name, but it echoed into silence. The guard dragged him away, his voice now reduced to the sound of a man whose power was finally gone. Outside, Emeka was waiting by the car. He didn't ask what happened inside. He didn't need to. Zara walked to him, placed her hand in his, and rested her head against his shoulder. For a moment, they just stood there, two souls who had walked through flames and now stood in calm. The sky above was clear. Peace, real peace, wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about owning it, surviving it, and then walking forward anyway. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but they knew one thing for sure: the worst was behind them. And love, the kind worth fighting for, had already won. The sun had barely risen when Emeka and Zara walked hand in hand through the old market street that once bore witness to the beginnings of their love and pain. Where once Emeka stood shirtless, hammering molten metal on a rusted anvil with calloused hands, now he stood tall, healed but scarred, beside a woman who had chosen to stand by him through chains and chaos. The two had found a quiet piece of land near the blacksmith district and begun building not just a home, but a sanctuary, a place for the forgotten, the abused, and the falsely accused. Zara used her inheritance not to live in opulence, but to support widows, blacksmith apprentices, and former inmates trying to rebuild their lives. She kept their names out of newspapers and refused all public attention. "Let our lives speak louder than headlines," she told Emeka, who nodded with silent understanding. Within months, the space transformed into a quiet haven. Old tools were restored. Former inmates now taught youths how to mold iron and purpose from pain. Widows and single mothers sold handcrafted items and learned trades. Emeka, though still haunted by what had been done to him, found healing in his hammer and anvil. Every clang was not just a sound of work, but a declaration that he had survived, endured, and risen. He was no longer just a poor blacksmith. He was a man reborn through fire. Zara, meanwhile, worked closely with the women, some of whom had been left behind like her, betrayed, silenced, mocked. To them, she was not just a benefactor, but a sister in pain, and her humility made her loved beyond measure. Though invitations to interviews and awards flooded in, the couple turned them all down. "We're not trying to inspire anyone," Emeka would say. "We're just making sure no one else suffers like we did." And that was enough. They lived quietly, away from the noise of wealth and reputation, in a house with no golden gates, just laughter from the children they sheltered and warmth from fires forged in dignity. They began sponsoring legal aid for those trapped in corrupt accusations and funding skill programs for former convicts. The community, once wary of Emeka's name, now hailed him with reverence. And yet, their love remained private, grounded not in grand gestures, but in the little things: a touch, a shared look, a quiet evening by the forge. They were no longer just lovers. They were builders of redemption. Emeka's mother had been in a semi-conscious state for months, her mind drifting between silence and murmurs. The doctors were cautiously hopeful, but Emeka's visits never waned. He sat by her bed daily, reading softly from the Bible or humming lullabies she once sang to him as a child. Zara often accompanied him, sometimes feeding her or gently massaging her feet. Though the old woman remained mostly unresponsive, there were moments her fingers would twitch or a tear would trail down her cheek. These small signs kept hope alive. Emeka, even while managing their new life and helping others, held on to one desire: to hear his mother's voice call his name once more, a sound he once took for granted, now a prayer in his heart. One evening, after a long day at the forge, Emeka sat with his head bowed beside her. Zara had stepped out to speak with the nurse when a low, raspy whisper broke the silence. Chukwuemeka, the name, his name, echoed through the sterile room like thunder wrapped in tears. Emeka froze, not believing his ears. His eyes widened as he turned to see his mother's gaze fixed weakly on him. Her lips trembled again, forming words with great effort. "My son, my strong son." Tears poured from Emeka's eyes as he clutched her hand and knelt beside her. For all the pain he had buried, for all the rage he had nursed, nothing compared to the relief of hearing her voice, fragile yet fierce. Zara returned just as Emeka sobbed into his mother's palm. The older woman slowly turned her gaze toward Zara and whispered, "Daughter." Zara broke down, dropping to her knees beside them. That moment, silent to the world but loud in their hearts, became a healing balm no medicine could match. The old woman, though weak, smiled for the first time in years. She didn't need to know every detail of what had happened. Her spirit sensed the suffering and the love that had survived it. As she lay back, Emeka promised her aloud, "I will never leave you again, and I will never let love be buried by injustice." His mother's eyes sparkled faintly as she squeezed his hand, then drifted back to sleep, no longer unconscious, but peacefully resting. Zara was now visibly pregnant, her belly a soft, glowing curve that reminded Emeka of both their pain and their rebirth. She often walked barefoot around their home, her laughter soft and deep, her joy quiet but present. One afternoon, she stood by the old forge with a chisel and whispered, "Let's do something permanent." Emeka, shirtless and now back to his full strength, looked up from his anvil and smiled. They carved their initials, Z and E, into the same anvil that once saw him struggle for scraps. Zara's hand trembled, not from fear, but from awe. "This fire never died," she said. Emeka kissed her forehead, then whispered, "It only waited." They spent that day in the workshop, sharing stories of how far they had come. Emeka spoke of the nights he nearly gave up, of the guard who slipped him bread in prison, of the bracelet he carved from scrap metal and hid in his pocket every time he was beaten. Zara, in return, confessed the nights she dreamt of seeing him in chains and would wake up screaming. They healed with each word, each story, not to forget, but to remember rightly. Emeka created a new ring that day, melting pieces of their old pain, the broken bracelet, a link from the chain he was bound with, into gold. "From the chains they gave me, I made a crown," he said quietly. That night, as the stars blanketed the sky, Zara and Emeka sat outside watching the flames flicker from the open forge. The community they'd built bustled gently around them. A child chasing a dog, a woman hanging clothes, a young man learning how to craft his first blade. The world had not changed. There was still betrayal and pain. But within their small circle, something beautiful was born. Not fame, not riches, but legacy. A love story carved into metal, into memory, into every fire that burned to keep someone else warm. They knew tomorrow would bring more challenges, but for that night, the forge didn't just hold fire. It held history, sacrifice, and a promise. The morning sun rose softly over the small village where Emeka had once lived in obscurity, just another blacksmith working beneath the weight of class and status. Now, years later, it was the same anvil, the same soot-stained walls, and the same tools that had once worn his palms to the bone, but everything had changed. In the center of the courtyard, their son, a bright-eyed little boy of 4, played with a wooden mallet carved by Emeka himself. His laughter was unburdened, his joy uninhibited. He knew nothing of prison cells, betrayal, or shame. He only knew the warmth of love, the security of truth, and the fierce embrace of 2 parents who had paid the price of love with blood, silence, and survival. Emeka stood silently by the doorway of the forge, watching the boy play. His body bore the reminders of where he had been. Long, jagged scars ran across his back, small burns dotted his arms, and a quiet limp in his left leg sometimes emerged when he was tired. But none of that weakened him. They were not signs of defeat, but marks of endurance. Zara stepped beside him, her head resting gently on his shoulder, her hand slipping into his with a familiarity that spoke of battles fought side by side. She had given up a life of comfort, had dared to challenge the very walls built to cage her, and in the end she found more than Emeka. She found herself. Their silence said everything. No gold mansion, no elite circle, no column in the newspaper could compare to the quiet beauty of that moment, of having survived the storm and built something sacred in its wake. Later that day, Emeka pulled the heavy doors of his forge open one last time. The fire inside still burned hot. The coals still glowed like embers of their past. He took the ring Zara had once worn, now slightly worn from years of work and life, and dipped it in a new alloy, giving it a second skin, a new shine. It was symbolic, as everything was with Emeka. Just like the ring, they had been through fire, reshaped by betrayal, strengthened by pain. Zara stepped beside him with their son, watching in reverence. Then, with a final strike of his hammer, Emeka sealed the fire, locked the forge, and turned to face his future. "This forge saved me," he said softly, voice cracking. "But now it's time to live, not just survive." Together, they walked away, not as fugitives or victims, but as a family forged from fire, shaped by chains, and freed by love. And for the first time in many years, Emeka smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer ruled them. The price had been paid. The chains had broken. And love, that stubborn, blazing flame, had endured it all. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.